class, the living conditions, particularly with the numbers involved. It seems in chapter 2 that we're dealing with about 50,000 men. And then if you have women and children, you could be dealing with a number in excess of 100,000 and closer to 200,000. And to have that amount of people move into a small territory like this is really going to upset the status quo and the development of the community. As we get to Haggai, obviously their existence was very, very meager. A mere 16 years later. Again, we could have the pattern of the Exodus generation going into the wilderness. 2 million people, and God taking care of them supernaturally, as Deuteronomy 8 affirms. So if we do, and the author does want us to read this against the pattern of the narrative in the Torah concerning the Exodus, and the inclusio, God's sovereign, powerful work involved in what is taking place here, and this generation being no more disobedient than the first generation of Israel out of the Exodus generation, probably are to understand that God in a supernatural way was taking care of them and providing for them because they're in Jerusalem to accomplish his plan and his purpose. But again, those kind of details are not given to us in the text, so we're again dealing with implications, interpretive implications, and all we can really do is look at what the text has to say. But you can't have even 50,000 individuals coming into that kind of an area without creating some serious ramifications. And you can realize then why the nations around Yehud, the peoples there, would respond in somewhat of a negative fashion. And obviously continued because you came here to build a temple, not to resettle a land. But in God's plan and purpose, there was a resettlement of the land as well as ultimately building the temple as well. So the Bible tells us what's essential for us to know about God's accomplishing his plan and his purpose according to his sovereign plan. Chapter 1, chapter 6, we've already seen with the inclusio. And that is the thrust and that is the emphasis of the text.
One other question. When it mentions temple servants, do you think any of those would be the Gibeonites?
Yes. Okay. Are the temple servants Gibeonites? Yes. They would be those that were pressed in the temple service because of their Joshua's covenant with them. And we do have the temple servants, and you also have the sons of Solomon's servants. They would be they would be those pressed into service by Solomon, through again the individuals conquered by David that became vassal peoples, and so they'd be pressed into service first in constructing the temple, and then serving in the temple as well. So those would be probably non-Israelites, and that is why when you get down to even verse 65, besides their male and female servants. So we do have some wealthy Israelites that are bringing possibly non-Israelite servants, because according to Torah they couldn't have anyone who saw themselves into servitude sabbatical year. That would all come to an end. So to have long-term servants would seem to be these would be non-Israelites as well. So very much again like the Exodus generation, we do have a mixed multitude. Yeah, predominantly Israelites, but there are non-Israelites in this group that do return.
So it almost sounds like that refutes the false narrative that the dissolving of marriages was about
Yes, it is, and that will be also refuted in chapter 6, in the passage that I'll preach, that anyone who purified themselves, enjoyed themselves with Israel, could participate in the Passover, and that would be non-Israelites. So right within the text of Ezra itself is the refutation of the fact that the problem was the fact that these were pagans, they were non-Israelites. No, they're non-Yahweh worshipers. That's the problem. The problem is religious, not ethnic. And like I said, even Ezra 6, there'll be an embrace of non-Israelites who are willing to worship Yahweh and in the prescribed manner. And of course, that goes back to the mixed multitude, and that goes back to proselytes that had been a part and parcel of Israel in the land, even with the first Exodus and conquest. So Ruth, though the text could have been written post-exilic, is talking about a pre-exilic situation. And I don't see that as being any different in post-exilic Israel as well, that as long as you say, your people, my people, your God, my God, all right, then you are part and can worship, with Israel, and can be brought in to Israel. Although even in Ruth, 11 times in that book, she's still called, even after that affirmation, Ruth the Moabitess, Ruth the Moabitess. Boaz marries Ruth the Moabitess. All right, so her Gentile background is continued to be emphasized, even though she becomes part of worshiping Israel. So, and I don't see that any different than what is here in Ezra-Nehemiah. A Gentile willing to convert becomes part of the worshiping community, becomes part of the assembly. Yeah. All right, on to chapter 3. And we see here a continued obedience of the people in the land. Chapter 3, verse 1, now when the 7th month came. Now I'm assuming that the people began to return from Babylon. As I said, you basically didn't travel in the ancient Near East over the winter time period. So probably they did begin like in Ezra chapter 7 in the first month, and so by the 6th month they are back in the land. So it might not have been quite as quick as during Ezra's narrative in chapter 7 and 8, but they do come, and as I said, there's no homes, there's no fields, etc. They have to establish themselves. And against that backdrop, when the 7th month comes, this is important to note, that their religious observance takes priority over their physical comfort. The seventh month comes, and verse 1, the people gathered together as one man in Jerusalem. Now, the text doesn't tell us. We have to go back to Torah to realize the first day of the 7th month is trumpets. Right? And the first day of the 7th month, the trumpets would sound throughout the land, calling Israel to solemn assembly at the central worship center. And so that's the reason why we find, if I can get, come on, there you are. We find them returning to Jerusalem in this solemn assembly. They gather together as one man in Jerusalem. And gathering as one man, verse 2, they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it, as is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. The first day of the 7th month is trumpets, is a call to solemn assembly to gather together at the central worship location. By the 10th day of the month is the Day of Atonement. So they're back in the land. They're gathered in Jerusalem. Now, they can't fulfill the Day of Atonement ritual because that includes taking blood into the temple building itself, into the most holy place. And there is no temple. There's only the temple site. There's just basically the vacant, desolate site where the temple had previously stood. But they were able to ascertain exactly where the altar in the court of the temple was, and they rebuild the altar. By rebuilding the altar, they're able to bring offerings and sacrifices. Now, at this point, they can't do anything manipulating the blood in the presence of Yahweh because that entails the temple building. But they want to start to build the offering of these burnt offerings. Now, burnt offerings, Leviticus chapter 1, were basically an acknowledgement of one's sinfulness and the need for the sacrifice, for forgiveness, and through the burnt offering, not only that, acknowledgement that one is a sinner who needs God's forgiveness, but based upon Yahweh's acceptance of the offering, it is also an offering of total commitment of life to Yahweh. Burnt offerings come very, very early in the biblical text. The first burnt offerings mentioned are in Genesis chapter 8 after Noah came out of the ark. He built an altar and offered burnt offerings to the Lord. So burnt offerings were known well before the cultic regulations were given to Israel at Sinai as a declaration of one's sinfulness, an acknowledgement of the need for substitutionary sacrifice for forgiveness. I remember with Leviticus chapter 1 how the offerer would put his hands on the head of the animal, showing his identification with what happened to that animal. He'd be the one who would put it to death, and then the priest would take the blood and obviously manipulate it before Yahweh on behalf of the worshiper. But the worshiper chose the animal, brought the animal, slew the animal, butchered the animal, and passed on the pieces to be burnt along with the blood to the priest for their priestly involvement and mediation. Now, obviously, in chapter 8, Noah is not only the offerer, he's also the priest offering that unto the Lord. Now, we're post-Sinai at this point, so this is all going to be done, as we read in verse 2, as is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. And all of this is taking place in obedience, verse 6, even before the foundation of the temple of the Lord had been laid. There is no foundation, there's no buildings taking place, but at least the rudimentary aspects of the sacrificial system are reestablished in the seventh month. And so the people could show their faith in and their commitment to Yahweh. So verse 3, they did set up the altar on its foundation. And notice the reason. For they were terrified because of the peoples of the lands. This is the introduction of the peoples of the lands, which we saw yesterday as a flat character throughout the book. They're always in opposition to Yahweh and always in opposition to what Yahweh is doing through his people. Now, we don't know in the few days or weeks that the people had returned what kind of interaction they had had with the peoples in the land, but they're already aware of the fact that they are being opposed. And so the burnt offering at this point is also their reaffirmation of commitment to Yahweh. That it is an indication, their fear of the peoples of the lands, that's, all right, and here's an echo back to the first Exodus. As the people come into the land in the book of Joshua, the Canaanites didn't embrace them with open arms. In fact, they resisted, except for Rahab and her family, and of course the deception of the Gibeonites, etc. But by and large, I mean, the Canaanites took them on. We're not ready to give up our land to you that easily. Well, here we got that implication here too. That as the people return, yes, with the decree of Cyrus that gives them, the affirmation that God is with them to build the temple, yet they face opposition. They face attack. And by chapter 4, verse 1, the narrator is going to make explicit these were enemies of Judah and Benjamin. They are adversaries. They were against what they were doing, even though they come with the request to join in the building of the temple. So the Israelites are aware of the fact that they're not being welcomed with open arms. In fact, they are being opposed. And so because they were terrified because the peoples of the land, their obedience in building the altar and offering the burnt offerings was, I think, a indication of their commitment to the Lord, their dedication to Yahweh. And as the offerings are consumed in the fire, an assurance that Yahweh is with them, protecting them, and going to enable them to accomplish the task for which they have come. So don't overlook that little, they were terrified because of the peoples of the land, and they offered burnt offerings on it to the Lord. Burnt offerings morning and evening. Now, significantly, just the same thing we'll see in Nehemiah chapter 9, a couple of generations later. We know about trumpets. They assembled as one man, assumed. And verse 4, they celebrate the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, as it is written. And the fixed number of burnt offerings daily, according to the ordinance, as each day required. And afterward, a continual burnt offering, as for the new moons and for the fixed festivals of the Lord that were consecrated, and from everyone who offered a freewill offering to the Lord. Do you realize that from the 7th month on, at least in these early months that are being narrated here, the Israelites heard Torah and obeyed exactly what Torah said about not only the offerings to be offered by Israel during the Feast of Booths, but also then the daily, the weekly, the monthly offerings as enumerated in Numbers 28, 29, that they followed the pattern that had been given to Moses, to the first generation of Israel, and they followed that pattern consistently, at least into the second year, the beginning of the second year, where they lay the foundation of the temple, as narrated in verses 7 to 13. What the author is doing is taking pains to say that these returnees were conscientious in their obedience to the Lord. That at this point, their commitment to Him and their willingness to obey why they had come back into the land for the purpose of building the temple was uppermost in their mind. It was their priority. It was their commitment. And they were willing to suffer personal hardship. And even with the beginning of opposition from the peoples of the land, that they were fully committed to Yahweh and accomplishing His plan and His purpose. So the implication at this point is not that they were wavering. Any wavering came out of fear, but had been allayed by the assurance that they were God's people doing God's will. And again, the consumption of the offerings was God's amen and gave them assurance. And so, with the beginning of the regular sacrifices, from the first day of the 7th month on, they then set about to lay the foundation of the temple. Because at the end of verse 6, they did this, and they were faithful and obedient to the Lord, even though the foundation of the temple had not been laid. It's very interesting. They didn't wait for a temple building to be obedient. And I think there's an implication here. It's very, very important, and that is we so many times think of Israelite religion as being physical instead of spiritual. If I can put it this way, it took a physical building. It took physical manifestation. You know, it took the vessels. It took everything, that had been built. Everything in terms of the tabernacle. It was built at Sinai. Exodus 37 to 40. That without the tabernacle and then ultimately without the temple, they could not worship the Lord. Well, before Sinai, Noah and Abraham worshiped the Lord, built altars and offered burnt offerings to the Lord. Even in the Old Testament, all right, yes, ultimately for Israel it becomes organized, and yes, there's a physical aspect to it, a visual aspect to it. But nevertheless, all that did was enhance what was already a spiritual interaction between God's people and the Lord. And that is established very early as the people come back to the land. And so there is implication, a note of commendation at this point. There is a committed people of God that without the physical accoutrements that are going to come, nevertheless show their faithful service to Yahweh. Yahweh can be worshipped without a physical building. That becomes very, very vital to see and be reminded of as we see the narrative that is here. Now, obviously, you don't want to just maintain an altar when God's plan is build the temple. So right away, verse 7, they gave money to the masons and carpenters and food and drink and oil to the Sidonians and to the Tyrians to bring cedar wood from Lebanon to the sea at Joppa, according to the permission they have from Cyrus, king of Persia. All right, so they have some way to be able to tell these, again, non-Israelites that they have permission from Cyrus to be able to get the physical material to be able to lay the foundation and rebuild the temple. Now, once we get the Sidonians and Tyrians, when we get cedar wood from Lebanon, all right, we're being reminded again of 1 Kings 5. We're being reminded again of what is in Chronicles. This is exactly how the first temple arrangements had to be made to bring materials, including cedars from Lebanon, by ship from Sidon, from Tyre, and brought down to Joppa, which became the seaport that then they were hauled up to Jerusalem. So again, we hear echo of, okay, what happened with the first temple is now taking place as far as the second temple is concerned as well, this basic pattern. So the verse 8, in the second year of their coming to the house of Jerusalem in the second month. So significantly at this point, you would have Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So any celebration there, again, takes place without the physical instrumentality of the temple. Not mentioned. We just jump ahead to the second year, second month. And of course, the second month is when Solomon commenced the building of his temple, the first temple as well. Again, we're hearing these echoes, the pattern of how it was in the past is now being reduplicated in this process. And the foundation of the temple is laid. In verse 10, when the builders had laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests stood in their apparel with trumpets. The Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the directions of King David of Israel. Going back to 1 Chronicles chapter 16, where he had set apart Levites, the family of Asaph, with cymbals and musical instruments to lead Israel in their praise of the Lord. So we not only have an altar, now we've got a foundation of the temple, and we have temple musicians leading the people in verbal singing the praises to the Lord. They sing, verse 11, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. So not only do we have the altar according to being used, the sacrifice, the offerings according to what was written in Moses, but we have the foundation of the temple being laid in the like manner of Solomon's temple, and we have singing taking place, praising the Lord in manner of how David had set up the singing, the Levite guilds for leading the singing as far as Israel is concerned. What the text is emphasizing is this is not, improvision 101. This is following the biblical mandate step by step. We're doing it exactly the way God commanded. We're doing it exactly the way it was patterned, because there aren't any kind of direct commandments. There's not commandments in the same way, dealing with the temple services and what day to lay the foundation of the temple, et cetera, and making arrangements to get the material. But they're following the biblical pattern. They're being led by Scripture. Important to see that implication. So they sang, praising and giving thanks to Yahweh. And significantly, verse 11 repeats the essential thrust of what is in 1 Chronicles chapter 16. In other words, they use the very same words to praise the Lord at the foundation of the second temple that they did at the foundation of the first temple. When David first set up the singing guilds of the Levites, this is how they led Israel in praise. Now they're doing it again. Again, following the pattern, following the order. And of course, this is a favored saying, not only from 1 Chronicles 16, but from the Psalter as well. For he, Yahweh, is good, for his loyalty is upon Israel forever. It's very interesting here. He is a good God. He's Tov. He is good. And because he is good, then everything he does is good and beneficial for his people. And that benefit that comes from a good Yahweh is based upon his covenant loyalty to Israel. He is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. His loyalty is upon Israel forever. Now, the covenant, therefore, that he's loyal to is the covenant he made with Israel at Sinai, that they would be his people and he would be their God, which is based upon a previous covenant he made with Abraham, that he had chosen Abraham and his seed after him. I think when it talks about loyalty here, I think the thrust is the loyalty that he has to Israel as his people. So the same God who met Israel at Sinai is the same God who meets Israel here. The same God who was faithful to bring Israel out of Egypt and bring them into the land, and to allow them as his people to build his temple where his presence would come, where he's able to worship, where they're able to worship him. They're able to acknowledge his forgiveness and their dedication to him through burnt offerings. Right? This is all being repeated because God is a loyal God. Of course, this whole concept of covenant loyalty is going to be very, very important when we get on Thursday and Friday to Israel's remembrance of Yahweh's work in their behalf, previous generations and their own, and the fact that he's a loyal God. And of course, by that point, they're able to look at their history and say, you're loyal and we are not. You're faithful to your word, we are not. They're not covenant keepers. They have been covenant breakers. And of course, by the end of the book, they're going to be covenant breakers all over again. But here it is positive, for he is good, and his loving kindness is upon Israel forever. And this all ties in with Old Testament worship. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised Yahweh, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Gentlemen, you cannot read the Old Testament without realizing when Israel worshiped the Lord in corporate solemn assembly, it was loud. They have the trumpets. They have the cymbals. Verse 10. They have instruments. Clayton Herb would be thrilled, to have the mass orchestra and choir of Levites leading the Israelites. And the Israelites sang with passion. They sang loudly. This is Dr. Montoya. Whatever you do it loud. Do it passionately. Crying out with a great shout when they praise the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. Yes, we do meditate upon Torah. Yes, when we come to the Lord personally, it is in quietness. But gentlemen, when you see Israel together worshiping God in the Old Testament, it is loud and it is exuberant and it is fully expressive. If you're ever in Israel, go down to the court yard before the Western Wall on the beginning of Sabbath and see how they just let loose. Singing, dancing, shouting, clapping, crying. That's the way it was here. And exuberance. By the way, the shout was so loud, people could hear it far away. By the way, those people, all Israel has been gathered together to celebrate the foundation of the laying of the temple, the laying of the foundation of the temple, who are far off to hear this? The people of the land. Realizing we can't let this continue on. That, of course, leads right into chapter 4. Okay, the enemies come. They're going to have to deal with this. They've come. They're settling in. They have reestablished their offerings, at least their foundational offerings, on an altar. They're laying the foundation of a temple. They're exuberantly worshiping their God. We're going to have to step in, else it's going to be too late. But before we hear about the sound being heard far away, verse 12 and beginning of verse 13 deal with the fact that there was loudness taking place, but the loudness came from two foundations, two motivations. In verse 12, some were weeping loudly, crying out in sorrow. These were many of the priests and Levites and heads of the fathers' households, the old men who had seen the first temple. I got to realize if this is right around, the beginning of 535 BC, we're about approximately 50 years since the destruction of Solomon's temple. So we're assuming here that these are individuals, men in their late 50s to early 70s. Interesting, men that age would make the trek back. See the implication here. You would think, to travel 1,000 miles from Babylon to Jerusalem with that kind of hardship would be a young man's adventure. A young man's venture because it would take energy. So don't miss it. Implication, there's many older men. I say that as an old man. I sometimes say, well, hey, let the young guys do it. They got the energy. They got the zeal. I'll tell them what to do. Gentlemen, you never get too old to serve the Lord. You never get too old to be dedicated to Him. And they're the ones who weep with a loud voice. They bewail. It's not joy on their part, it's sorrow. Because they look at the foundation and realize the temple will not be as grand and glorious, as large as the previous temple. There'll be a temple, but it won't be anything like the previous temple. By the way, I can say just a little implication here. Old men, be careful you don't live with past glory. Now, implication, the people, there were many who shouted aloud for joy. If you're not restricted by the remembrance of what was before, just to have the foundation of the temple brings great joy. So the older men are crying, and the younger men are just exuberant with joy. They're both giving forth loud cries, loud sounds, but they're coming from two different hearts. So much so, people could not distinguish the sound of the shout of joy from the sound of the weeping of the people. They all sounded the same. But the narrator says, but the heart which produced the sound was different. And of course, since it was a loud noise, a loud shout, it was heard far away. And you have to realize the Temple Mound is called the Temple Mound for a purpose. It's the top of a hill. Right? And so if you got, I don't know, 50,000 men yelling at the top of their lungs, young and old. The sound is reverberating, in valleys and canyons. That's a lot of noise traveling a loud distance. This also implies that there were some peoples of the land who had moved into what is now going to be the territory that the Persians are going to give to the returning exiles, which become the province of Yehud. Or did they come knowing that all Israel was gathered together to give this celebration? Did they come near to kind of spy out what was taking place and hearing all of this? But nevertheless, the text is clear. The sound was heard far away. This made an impact upon the peoples of the land. And again, I think there's an implication here that when we serve the Lord and when we worship Him with exuberance, it will make an impact upon the non-believing community. So, what I've obviously given to you here, and you can look in the future, I've given you kind of the sermon outlines that I have, put together with the book. So, the praise of the people, thanksgiving accompanied by both joy and sorrow, and the impact that it makes. Well, we've now been introduced implicitly, verse 3 and verse 13, to the peoples of the land. What are they going to do about it? Let me just go up very quickly to our overall outline. They're going to interact now with the Israelites. And the author leaves you in no doubt. He's explicit. 4:1, now when the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the people of the exile were building a temple to the Lord God of Israel, they approached the rubble. We're already told that even though their words might sound sincere, they are sworn enemies to what is taking place. They are enemies of Judah and Benjamin. And yet chapter 3 has shown that Judah and Benjamin are in complete and total obedience to Yahweh, following His directives, being totally committed to Him. And so as they are fully obedient to the Lord, they ruffle the feathers of the peoples of the land. Now, it is significant they don't begin with a frontal attack. They're enemies, we already know that from verse 1, but they come as friends. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons why the Spirit leads the author to say, and let us know they're enemies, because without knowing that, you can hear what they say in verse 2 and the responses of Zerubbabel and Joshua and the leaders in verse 3 and say, that seems insensitive. So verse 2, what is their appeal? Let us build with you. Okay, you're come back to build the temple? We'll help. We'll join you. For we, like you, seek your God. And we have been sacrificing to Him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. But there's an element of truth here. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 17. But after the Assyrians had defeated the Israelites and had taken Samaria, had taken the northern kingdom, they did bring pagans, and they did settle them in the land and intermarry with the Jewish women. And they brought their pagan gods with them. And so God sent lions among them to eat them, and they said, "Oh, we better be careful here. The gods of the lands are against us." So they sent to the Assyrians, who sent a renegade Levite to instruct them in the Lord Yahweh, the God of the land. And so they became syncretists. They worshiped Yahweh as well as worshiping their gods. Right? So when they said, "Let us, we like you seek your God," there's an element of truth to that. There's an element of this truth. We seek your God along with other gods. That's what they didn't say. And we've been sacrificing to him, which is true. All right? They have acknowledged Yahweh. They have sacrificed him as well as sacrificing to the pagan gods as well. And so these, what I would call rather than Samaritans, the point Sumerians, because we don't at this point have a full-blown Samaritan religion. That's going to develop in the intertestamental period. So Sumerians will become Samaritans. I forget which commentator helped me on that, so I refer to them as Sumerians, that is, inhabitants of Samaria, the northern part of ancient Israel, the northern 10 tribes. Okay, these Sumerians that have been placed there by later Assyrians after the destruction of the northern kingdom, and they were syncretistic worshipers of Yahweh. And of course, later on, they're going to actually rid themselves of some of that syncretism and have the full-blown Samaritan religion that we have by the time we get to the New Testament, which is not as syncretistic as what is here. So these pagans come with an element of truth, and so since we also seek your God, can we join with you in building a temple to him? But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of the fathers' households of Israel said to them, "You have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God." You don't have a common faith. Now, one thing the Babylonian exile did for the Judeans is it rid them of idolatry. Idolatry was their besetting sin, as you read in Kings. And even Jeremiah 11. Your gods are as many as your cities. Every city, every town, every community has idols that you worship, along with showing up at Jerusalem and worshiping the Lord. In fact, pre-exilic, Israel, the generations, leading up to the Babylonian captivity, those Judeans, according to the book of Jeremiah, were no better than these pagans that we meet in Ezra chapter 4. They were as syncretistic as what these pagans were. But in the exile, and God puts them into the mother of all harlotry, the place where idolatry, as it were, began, Babylon. And so that was used of the Lord to bring them to their senses. We will serve Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And so they come back and say, "You have nothing in common with us." Our ancestors used to be syncretists just like you, and we're no longer syncretists. We now worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And by the way, going back to chapter 1, the proclamation. The proclamation to build the temple was given to whom? Israel by Cyrus, not the pagans. Among you of his people, go up and build the temple for the God who is in Jerusalem. It was a proclamation, it was a mandate given to Israel and Israelites. The seed of Abraham, not the pagans. So they're right. You have nothing in common with us in building a house to our God. We ourselves together will build it to Yahweh, God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. We're the ones who've been commanded. We will do it. And you can't join us anyway because you don't worship Yahweh wholeheartedly and exclusively as we do. That did not make the people in the lands very happy. They show their true colors. Verse 4 and 5, then the people of the land, discouraged, weakened the hands of the people of Judah and frightened them from building. Now, the text doesn't say how. Because we already know the people feared them, 3:3. But they're frightened from building. At this point, there's no evidence that the Israelites had any kind of military prowess. So it could have been a show of military force. It could have been, it could have been mocking, scorning, ridiculing. It could be out and out attack. But they frightened them from building and hired counselors. So they have a two-pronged offensive. Number one, in the land, let us bring great fear upon the people so they stop building. And since they are appealing to the decree from Cyrus, let's hire counselors, probably a better term here is lawyers, against them to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So also send some sophisticated lawyers back to, central headquarters to the Persian king, because we know how easy Persian kings can be persuaded to back off, and that's exactly what they do. So they seek to influence the Persian king. We get some idea of that in the letter that is going to be recorded for us from a later generation in chapter 4, beginning in verse 11. And so they turn the Persian kings, the Persian administration against them, while showing their power and superiority over the people in the land. Effectively stopping the building of the temple. So now let's just move to the notes on chapter 4. I call them the loyal opposition. Put loyal, obviously, in quotation marks. In fact, I called it a kind request, which on the surface seems that way, but of course really wasn't, from the enemies of Israel. Okay, question?
I just find it interesting in the ESV for verse 4, it says it made them afraid to build, where in the NAS it sounds like kept them from building. Any comments on this distinction?
Frighten them from building. I think the ESV is accurate at this point. They put fear into the people that if you continue to build, there's going to be serious consequences. And there was. Assumption, verse 23 of chapter 4 speaks about a later military involvement, but then goes on, and the work on the house of God in Jerusalem ceased. I think there was some kind of military intervention that took place. Now there wasn't a whole lot to destroy, at this point, the altar and foundation, as opposed to the later letter, which is the walls are starting to be rebuilt. So there's something to tear down. But I think the implication is that that they were made afraid to continue because there was some kind of military action that took place. Whether anybody was injured or killed, I mean, again, the text doesn't tell us what the implication of that might be, but there was some kind of show of force that, all right, if you continue to build, there's going to be physical hostilities. And of course, like I said, you got these returnees, and they have no military training, they have no military hardware, they have no way to withstand that. And so, yeah, they're afraid. It's kind of like, Tiananmen Square, a person standing before a tank. Okay, I'm either going to die or I'm going to surrender. And of course, both happened in Tiananmen Square. And I know I'm dating myself. That was back in 1989. Some of you weren't even probably... But the I mean, yeah. Well, what's going to place today in Hong Kong? I mean, okay, you're fighting with sticks and stones. A well-armed militia, and all they're trying to do, of course, is get the world opinion against the Chinese. That's the only way they're going to get them back down. The protesters can't fight power with power, and that's what you got here. And so when they cower before the power. And again, it's by implication, because I believe that what happened in Artaxerxes' day is also what happened in Cyrus's day. Now, to solidify that, let's also turn the Persian king against them as well. Right? Because they're building, and they're going to reiterate that in chapter 5, we're building under the authority of the king. By the way, that's the great thing Nehemiah is going to bring. Nehemiah is going to bring kingly authority to bear later. It's not that he was a great administrator. It's the fact he had power that was able to, he had the power of the king. By the way, it's very interesting. I got to be careful here because I can't steal the thunder for the next few days. One of the questions you should ask is, why was it okay for Ezra to turn down military support and Nehemiah take it? One of your questions, good for you. And we'll answer that in a couple of days. Because of the nature of what Nehemiah went to do. So we'll see. But these people like Ezra, they have no military means. They have to succumb. And you can have the law of the king, but if you don't have the power to back it up. But knowing that, the adversaries also turn the Persian king against the Jews as well. And so this is what you've gotten in chapter 5, 6, what you're going to have again in chapter 7, what you're going to have in Nehemiah 2. They're going to bring the same ruse against Nehemiah chapter 6. But you got the fact that you're going to have Israelites being able to change the mind of the king. And because that's also part of the strategy. Keep the kings of Persia anti-Jewish. Now that gets us in to verses 6 to 23. Right, this happens during the days of Cyrus, and we find out in verse 24 until the second year of the reign of King Darius. This powerful opposition in the land and this turning of the Persian kings against the Jews. And the author at this point decides to tell us as readers that this didn't just happen in 535 BC, the 520 BC. This continued. And particularly the strategy of turning the Persian kings against the Jews was an ongoing strategy for the next century. through the reign of Artaxerxes. What began in 535 BC was still their strategy in 435 BC. By the way, if it works, don't give it up. But in doing so, he lays a historical foundation for everything else as said historically in the book all the way through chapter 13. How? Well, verse 6. Now in the reign of Ahasuerus, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against all the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay, now we're finding out they hired kings to frustrate their counsel all the days of Cyrus and into Darius' reign. They do the same as Ahasuerus, or Xerxes becomes king. We talked about that yesterday. Now we know from the book of Esther, and ultimately Mordecai seeking the welfare of the Jews, that it didn't continue on through all the days of Ahasuerus. But again, they're using that strategy. They immediately, when he becomes a power, they try to turn him against him. And then there's a debate, verses 7 and 8, but because different individuals are mentioned, and 4:8 turns to Aramaic, it seems as though verse 7, as you note from the notes, is a letter sent to Artaxerxes, again, in the pattern that's developed against Israel at the beginning of his reign, in the days of Ahasuerus, Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes, king of Persia, and the text of the letter was written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic, although the letter isn't given to us. Because the letter referred to in verses 8 and following comes from Ram and Shimshai. So it seems to be a later letter. Implication, my interpretation of this is, they have been successful during the reign of Cyrus. They have been successful, at least partially, during the reign of Xerxes, Ahasuerus. The same strategy is followed in about 464 when Artaxerxes becomes king. Let's turn him against the Israelites. Yet by the time we get to verse 8, we are into a third letter, and notice significantly verse 12. Well, here's the letter that is sent from the adversaries. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you, Artaxerxes, implied, have come to us at Jerusalem. They are rebuilding the rebellious and evil city and are finishing the walls and repairing the foundations. You know, there's two things here. Whoever is instigating this building project come with the authorization of Artaxerxes. They come from you. And second of all, it is not rebuilding the temple, it is rebuilding the city by finishing the walls and repairing the foundations of the city. So this is not a letter. This is yes, it echoes a letter that was sent, during the days of Cyrus. But it's specifically a letter that was sent during the time of Artaxerxes, at a time when people with Artaxerxes' authorization are rebuilding the wall. I submit to you, that's going to be the background to Nehemiah 1. So let it be known to the king, here's their basic attacks. Worked so well for generations, we'll keep it up. Let it be known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and it will damage the revenue of the kings. Hey, we're looking out for you, King Artaxerxes. You let this continue even though They come on your authority, they're going to rebel when it's all done, and you're going to lose all that taxation, all that tribute, all that money. We're looking out for your best interests. Now, because we're in the service of the palace, and it's not fitting for us to see the king's dishonor, therefore we send and inform the king. So a search may be made in the record books of your fathers, and you'll discover in the record books and learn that the city is a rebellious city and damaging to kings and provinces, and that they have incited revolt within it in past days. Therefore the city was laid waste. By the way, the Persians inherited all of the records of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. In fact, the kings of the Persians refer to themselves as the king of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. So when he says, go back to the records, he's saying, going back to the records of, well, all the way back to, well, remember Hezekiah, 701 BC? Right. Babylonian records, remember Nebuchadnezzar and his 4 little problems with Jerusalem in the past? All there in the books, all there in the records. And by the way, it was there. Jerusalem did have a reputation of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, of being what? Rebellious city. Gentlemen, implication. It's difficult to live down past sins. They were rebellious people. Now, they're not rebellious at this point to the Persian kings. They're faithful. They're loyal. By the way, where they're located, right on the border of Egypt, the Persian king was very concerned to keep those provinces loyal to him because of the buffer between themselves and the open hostility that the Persians have with the Egyptians. Talk about a rebellious people. The Egyptians were rebellious and continue to be rebellious against first the Babylonians and now the Persians. It's interesting, they could try to conquer Egypt and they could stay for a while, but Egypt was so far away from the base of power that neither the Babylonians nor the Persians could hold on to Egypt long term. There's always a way that they could go further south, that the Egyptians regroup, south of the Delta, and come back and, have a powerful blow against first the Babylonians and then the Egyptians. The Egyptians, of course, became the encouragers of Judah, beginning with Hezekiah on with the Assyrians. They become, the encouragers of Judah to do the same. Join us in our rebellion against. They'd never conquered by the Assyrians, but join us against the Assyrians. Join us against the Babylonians. Join us against the Persians. And again, in the past, they had done so. They're not doing so now. But again, your past comes back to haunt you. All right, question.
I'm failing to understand why the letter was written in Aramaic and why they're making a point to say that it was written in Aramaic and also translated in Aramaic.
At this point, you're actually reading it in Aramaic. And I think what they're saying is it's written and then translated, that is read to the king.
Well, why did they write to the king of Persia in Aramaic?
Because that was a diplomatic language.
That was okay.
So the Jews would have had to do the same. In other words, so Aramaic becomes the language of commerce, the language of diplomacy during the Persian Empire. Good question.
Yeah, what's the point of having
And the king is not necessarily literate. The king doesn't necessarily read. He has to have it read to him. So translated in the sense that it's read to him out loud. And he hears it and then responds. And so that's what is the background to this. All right, and again, they put the letter in Aramaic. In fact, all the way now through chapter 6. Verse 18 is going to be Aramaic. And basically what you have is letters going back and forth between the king and the people in the land. In Artaxerxes' day and then in 5 and 6 back to Darius' day. Well, so we inform the king, verse 16, if the city's rebuilt, the wall's finished, as a result, you will have no possession in the province beyond the river. Not only will this infect just this one province, this is going to have the whole satrapy. Everything west of the Euphrates, you will lose. By inference, there's a knowledge that ultimately the promise to Israel goes all the way to the Euphrates. Abrahamic covenant. Okay, from the brook of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates is the land promised to Abraham. And king, if you let this city rebel, you'll lose the whole province because once they have their little province, they're gonna think their God is going to give them everything. See the implication? Now they're even using their theology against them. Because Israel, well, by vassalship did during David and Solomon, but Israel has never dwelt in that whole land. They have never controlled that whole land. Even during the time of David and Solomon, they had treaties, with the Canaanites, with Hiram, king of Tyre. They never had any presence. They either dwelled or conquered or had treaties with the people of the land. They have never exercised unilateral, autonomous control of that land promised to Abraham in the past. But it is the promise. And by the way, it still motivates Israel to this day. What do our diplomats, Western diplomats, worry about? Some of those rebellious Orthodox Jews are going to take the Bible literally and think that they can conquer that whole land. Now that's a smidgen of people in Israel today who have any idea, what the ancient promise is. But there are some Orthodox sects that they're all about getting the whole land back, and they'll go by hook and crook to do it. So, okay, I got to be careful here, but I mean the Jews can be just as much a terrorist as those they're being attacked by. So, we have to be, careful. But that's what they're bringing up at this point. Artaxerxes, you let this happen. You're not going to lose taxes. You're going to lose the whole satrapy. And so the king searches, sends a letter back. You're right. And so, notice, he speaks about how this has all been discovered. So now, verse 21, issue a decree to make these men stop. Why? That this city may not be rebuilt until a decree is issued by me. They're to stop. But he leaves open the possibility a decree can be issued, but until it is, the city's not to be rebuilt. And so we kind of put in the back of our mind, have to wait for a number of chapters to, okay, is there going to be a further decree that's going to allow Jerusalem to be rebuilt? Wait and see. Unless you read the book and you already know. And so beware of being negligent in carrying this out. Why should damage increase the detriment of the kings? Now their own interpretation is not only to stop the work, but to destroy what's already been done. That's the point of verse 23. They went in haste to Jerusalem to the Jews and stopped them by force of arms. Implicit, they not only stopped the work, they destroyed the work that had been done, to be continued in Nehemiah chapter 1. And the work on the house of God in Jerusalem ceased. So the pattern again, the pattern that happened in Artaxerxes' day happened in Cyrus's day, so the work stopped on the temple until the second year of Darius. I don't need to give you all the insight on what happened during Cyrus's day because it was just the same thing that happened in Artaxerxes' day. Same turning of the Persian king against the Jews.
Why it says on verse 24, so Darius came after Artaxerxes, not the other way around.
No. You have Cyrus, Cambrius, which was not in the Old Testament, Darius.
Right.
Xerxes or Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is two past Darius.
Right.
But what you've done is you've jumped ahead. In verses 8 through 23, you've jumped ahead. I'm going to give a round number right around 450 BC, 448 BC. And now you jump back to 535 BC to the second year of Darius, 520 BC in verse 24. All the author's saying at that point is, same thing that happened in the future happened in the past. I'm not going to repeat it for you, but the work on the temple stopped as well. Not only did they stop the building of the walls in the future, and with the same ruse, with the same arguments, they also brought about the decision of the Persian king to stop the building of the temple as well. That now has to be corrected by a further decree from the Persian king, which is what's going to happen in chapter 6. Well, you have to read carefully, don't you? All right, but when you unravel it, it all makes sense. So be patient. Be patient in your reading of God's word. Ask those questions, you'll get the answers as you unravel that. Well, our time is way past. Let me do this. Let me give you just a 10-minute break. You all right? Yeah. All right. Yeah. Can you hang in there? Yeah. So, because it's already 11:14 by my watch. That clock is slow. So let's go ahead and just take 10 minutes. Then we'll be back. And we're going to have to be very, very quick on chapters 5 and 6. And then we'll end with our exposition of 19 to 22 of chapter 6. Okay, so 10 minutes. And I'll turn the mic off. But you can see why